think just when we start to realize, when we start to really grasp the identity that God places on us, we face the new struggle in a new way, same old struggle with our identity, and we start to have to remind ourselves what God calls us. And as we were praying for you guys, this is our last night, and thank you. You guys are the dedicated people that stuck it out both days for Dwell, and I really, really appreciate it. Our team has been working so hard. We've had such a heart to see God move. And not just big worship times. I mean, we've had amazing worship times, and we have Phil Wickham and people like that are coming and blessing us. But this entire conference was never about those sort of big moments. It really was about the small moments of God speaking identity and freedom, replacing old names with new names. This is something that really for us has been part of why we did this, really the main reason why we did this from the beginning. And Cora, who is up here speaking this morning, she had a word for our team. She said, I see this banqueting table, this table laid out in front of us. And she said, I felt like there was this barrier, like we could see this beautiful table that was laid out. And she said, there's a bunch of us, and we were following Jesus, but we were hanging out on the outside of this table looking in because we didn't feel worthy to be a part of what was happening. We didn't feel worthy enough or important enough to sit at the table. And our prayer for everyone in this room would be that you would know that God has invited you to the table. He has invited you into all the things that you imagine you can't be invited into. He doesn't look at your past. He never disqualifies you from sitting at the table because you never qualified to begin with. Jesus was the one that qualified you to sit at that table. And we can boldly approach the throne of God, the Bible says, because of that. Because of what Jesus gave us, we can boldly approach the throne. So tonight I just want to tell you that it's not too late, that you're not disqualified, that you can sit at that table. And our heart was not for just a conference that would encourage you and equip you, all of that stuff. I hope you had a good time with the breakouts and everything. I hope you got some practical stuff. But at the end of the day, our heart really was that you would leave this conference changed. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the title of my message today is called The New Name. That God wants to give you a new name. Throughout the Bible, you could see from, Saul to Paul, there's a lot of times when in the Bible where God gives a new name, where there's a new season. And for some reason, he says, you were called this, but now you're called that. For some reason, there's something really important that happened in life. And for Saul, it was like he came to see Jesus. He had this interaction with Jesus, and there was a line drawn in the sand, and he was Saul, and then he became Paul. Something brand new. But I want to talk about, I was going through all the names of people in the Bible that had changed their names because of a call of God. And I want to go all the way back to the beginning. Genesis 17, Abraham. And I'm going to read, picking up in verse 4, Genesis 17. Behold, my covenant is with you. So the backstory here, we're in the beginning of Genesis 17. Abram was his name. He had been told that his life was going to be so fruitful that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, that there'd be so much fruit in his life, it would be incalculable. God said, I have this promise for you, Abram. You are going to have this amazing fruit in your life, and it's coming. And in Genesis 17, Abram is 99 years old. I don't know how many of you are waiting for a promise from God, but I don't think there is one 99-year-old in this crowd. I could be wrong. I don't know. 99 years old. Some of us can't even wait 6 months for something to happen. 99 years old. No fruit. God said, you're going to be this fruitful guy. You are going to be the father of many nations. And Abram has been sitting on that for a long time. He's questioned it. He tried to take matters into his own hands with Hagar. He tried to do a lot of things. There's moments where he doubted that God was actually going to come through on it, and I honestly can't blame him. 99 is a long time. And can you imagine how many times he told his kids or told his wife, how many times maybe they rolled, his kid and his wife and his friends, and how many times did they roll their eyes like, yes, Abram, we've heard this before. You're going to have a ton of kids, but have you seen you? Have you seen your wife? It makes absolutely no sense. And at 99, he must have looked like a crazy old man to believe God for anything at this point. In verse 4, God starts to speak to him and says, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. And I will make you into nations, and kings shall come to you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you." I have to imagine that God recounting this dream and vision to Abram had to feel a little bit like salt in the wound. 99 years old, he's going, "Hey, Abram, remember, I'm going to make you a great nation." And he must be sitting there in the back of his mind going, "You're amazing. I'm blown away. You're the God of the universe. You're in front of me. But really? Like, really, you've been telling me this for a long time, and I have not seen any fruit." And Abram never saw the fruit of what God promised. But Abraham did. He needed a new name. He needed something, a line in the sand that says, "You were Abram and now you're Abraham." As I started to dive into it, I started to see a lot of people commenting on what that means. And it's funny, when you look in your Bible, it says Abraham. It says it's probably translated the father of a multitude or the father of nations. But it says that little asterisk, probably, because they're kind of inferring it from the text, saying, no longer are you going to be this great father, now you're going to be the father of nations. But the reason they say probably is because God basically reworks Abram's name to Abraham. And as I was diving in, I started to read some commentaries, and I was like blown away. So Abram in Hebrew, and Abraham in Hebrew, the only difference is one letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Just one letter. God takes one letter and shoves it in the middle of Abram's name, and it turns to Abraham. And the letter that he shoves in the middle of Abram is the letter that's in the middle of the word Yahweh. He takes a letter out of his own name. God removes a letter from his name, and he shoves it right in the middle of Abram's name, and he becomes Abraham. God takes a piece of himself, and he puts it into Abram's life. And he says, now you're going to be fruitful. You weren't fruitful before, and you knew me. I think a lot of us think like we're going to get this new name when we come to know Jesus. Which, yes, we're called children, we're forgiven. There is this sort of new identity that's placed in us when we're walking in darkness. Yes, we're conveyed into the kingdom of light, Colossians says. All of that. But I think there are several times in our lives where we go through a name change. We go from that moment where God says, you're going to be fruitful in the future, to now you are fruitful. And that's your name change. started realizing recently that I had been imagining that my identity was really secure. I tried really hard to be like, you know what, I'm a child of God. There's so much beautiful imagery, you know, like we're a royal priesthood. There's all these things in the Bible that's like, this is who we are. We're children of God. And these are awesome, awesome things. But I started to realize they were like bouncing off of me. I don't know if you're like me. It's like you hear this all the time now. People are talking about real identity, right identity in Jesus. And after a while, it started to not affect me anymore. I was going, yeah, I get that. I understand that. But for some reason, it's not penetrating my heart anymore. And I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. And you start to like war in the spirit, and you start to do all these things. And what's so amazing is come January, I did one little thing that started to shift a lot inside of me. And we did our fasting season. A lot of churches nowadays do it, which I love. January, you know, we set aside the whole month we fast one of the days, and we really try to pick up some new spiritual habits in our life to form us. And one of the things I started to do was I started to sit down before I read, because, you know, I grew up a Christian. I'm like, quiet time. I know quiet time, you know. Since my days in Young Life, I learned what a quiet time is. It's you sit down with your journal, you read the Bible, maybe you write a little something, spend a little time praying. I've been doing that for a long time. I've been doing that for over 20 years of my life. And I started a new habit in January, and it was just a small thing. But I would sit down before I'd pray, before I'd read. I would take a deep breath. I had this like inside me, I'm like, I have to combat this lack of presentness in my life. So I took a deep breath, and I would sit there. And before I started praying, before I started reading, I started analyzing myself just a little bit. And I'm like, okay, what are you hearing? What are you smelling? What are you feeling? What are you seeing? You know, and I'm sitting in my kitchen, try to wake up before my kids, which is a miraculous feat. And most nights I'm sitting there, most mornings, it feels like night because it's dark outside before the kids are awake. And I'm sitting in the kitchen, and I'm really trying to like analyze a little bit. And I started to analyze things like, Ryan, what are you thinking about? I know this doesn't feel like Christian quiet time yet. I'm not talking to Jesus yet. I'm talking to myself. I'm going, Ryan, what are you feeling? And I started to go, gosh, I'm thinking about Dwell. It's stressing me out, you know? Like, how's it making you feel? It's like, I'm tense. I'm like, oh, okay, stop being tense, you know? I read this thing in neuroscience. When you start to become a little bit more self-aware, when you start to really like pay attention to what you're doing, you start to shift all the brain activity from the back of your brain, which is like the guttural, emotional sort of place, and you start to shift it to the frontal lobe of your brain, where you could be a little bit more analytical. And unlike any other creature in creation, humans have this unique ability to step outside of themselves and look at themselves with a bit of curiosity. Right now, I am paying attention to the very Italian things I'm doing with my hands right now. I'm paying attention to like the intonation of my voice. I am outside of myself. This is a miraculous thing that God gives us, that we could look at the things that we're doing. And I found after a while, I would shift into reading the Bible, I would shift into praying, but I would start to realize where I was at. And I realized, I'm like, I can't combat bad identity if I don't even know what identity I'm speaking over myself to begin with. And I'm going to be real vulnerable with you guys. Be gentle with my heart as I share this with you. In the beginning of our fasting season, after some time of just kind of analyzing myself, I wrote down the things that I really thought about myself. And I got pretty in-depth. And I'm just going to read some of them. I feel like an angry dad. I feel like a disengaged person. I feel like I talk big, but I can't deliver. I feel like my leadership doesn't live up to the expectations of those that follow me. I feel like a bad friend. I feel like a poor conversationalist. I feel like my relationships are stuck or declining. I feel like I'm losing or have already lost who I am. I feel more accomplished, but less secure. This is me in 2020. God, I pray that you replace these with truth that you say about me. I pray that I can replace these thought strongholds with something new. God, help me. That was the end of my day 0 prayer. And after a month of, I would look at this every day and I'd go, okay, God, this is what I feel about myself. I feel like I'm a bad friend. I feel like I'm an angry dad. I feel like these are the things that, not just that I do, it felt like who I was. Like this was deep down what I was saying over myself. I was like cursing myself and I didn't even know it. Like these were things that I was repeating in the background of my thought life, and I had no idea it was there until I took a moment to say, God, I know what you think about me, but I don't know what I think about me. And how can I undo what I think about me if I'm not even aware of it? A lot of us have these things that we're thinking about ourselves over and over, and I bet even just for a minute right now you can think of one, maybe 2, maybe 10. There's some things that when you pause, you go, oh, I feel like I'm not this, or I feel like I'm not that. And you have to be aware enough of the names that you're calling yourself so that you could say, God, replace these names. And it's so funny, this was January, and we're in the end of February, and I already look over these and I go, I don't think that anymore. I don't think that anymore. I don't think that anymore. There's a few of these I'm still thinking, I'm working on. But that comes when you lay it down and you go, okay, this is it. This is what I'm praying into. This is who I am not. One of the most unhealthy identity anchors that we can anchor into, and an identity anchor is just something that you're trying to attach your identity to that is something other than God. It's something that's movable. It's something that when it goes away, your life falls apart. Identity anchors, unhealthy identity anchors, are things that can shift on us all the time. And one of the biggest unhealthy identity anchors that we have is, I am what I do. I am what I do. Years ago, I always joke, I got saved when I was, 15. I got invited to a small group. And maybe 16, something like that. And a youth leader said, hey, Ryan, why don't you come and play guitar in our small group? And I said, great. He's like, yeah, you can play some worship songs. And I was like, what are those? And he's like, oh, they're just like Christian songs. I was like, well, it sounds kind of dorky, but I guess I'll do it. And I always joke that I started leading worship before I was a Christian. I started playing worship in a small group, and after a while, I was like, you know what? There's something going on in this group that I need. There's something in this group that I'm missing in my life, and I started to realize that thing was Jesus. And some people have that moment where you're like, you know, I was saved at this day, at this hour, in this minute. For me, it was this process, and that's why I'm like 15, 16, something like that. It took me a while. I sat in a group. I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of doubts, and it was a long, long process. And one day I kind of woke up, and I'm like, I guess I'm a Christian now. First Christian in my family. My parents weren't Christian. But from the beginning of me getting saved, my identity was anchored into this title that I started to really hold on to. And really, I started to white knuckle. I didn't realize it. This identity of worship leader. It's like, I'm a worship leader. I'm worship leader Ryan. That's what I do. When I was in YWAM, my wife and I were in YWAM, I would lead worship 2 to 3 times a week in our, throughout the week. And there would be small groups that we would join. And every time people would be like, come lead worship, Ryan. And I'd go, great, that's what I do. I'm worship leader Ryan. And I'd come in and, sing a Delirious song because it was the late 90s. And that's what I did. I'm like, I'm worship leader Ryan. Before I came to Phoenix, I joined a a church plant called U City in Tucson, Arizona. And we started this church. I was the worship pastor, and we started this church down by the university. And within 3 months, we grew to 500 people, which Phoenix is pretty dry, but Tucson is like super dry spiritually. It's like you are really weird if you're a Christian. And to grow a church up to 500 that quick was like wild and outrageous. And at the end of this wild and outrageous growth, we met a guy named Mark Buckley. And Mark said, "Ryan, you want a job up in Phoenix?" And I thought, the hotter version of Tucson. I don't know if I want to do that. I said, okay. And my wife and I both felt like there's this process of leading us to Phoenix. And when we came here, I accepted a position that was not a worship leader. And I was like, I'm sure I'll keep leading worship all the time, you know. And God was like, nope, not anymore. And all of a sudden, my world came crashing down. Something that was so good. Worship leader Ryan. That's a great thing. It's a Christian thing. It's a biblical thing. I felt like a Levite. Like I'm going, man, I'm that forever. And all of a sudden I was like, no, I'm not worship leader Ryan. I'm worshiper Ryan, but not worship leader Ryan. And it hurt. It was really, really painful. Any of you who have gone through a season where you're a church leader and then you're not that church leader anymore, that's a really, really painful season. But these identity anchors where it's like, this is what we do, so that's who we are, you know? So the minute that you lose your job, if your identity is in your job, now your life is falling apart. If your identity is in the ministry that you're doing and your church blows up or something happens or they don't need you to do that ministry anymore, now your life is in ruins. Because you are anchoring who you are into what you do, and we are not supposed to do that. The world tries to do this with even sin. They say, you know, like, it's not just that you're you're gay you or you're straight you. You know, they try to define you. Not just like say that this is something that behavior, but they say this is who you are. That sin is now who you are. It's one of those reasons why we get this kickback from the world when they're like, oh, no, don't tell me that this thing is sin, because this is not just behavior, this is me, this is who I am deep down. And their identity is anchored in the wrong place. Your identity is not anchored in the sin you committed. It's not anchored in the job you have. It's not anchored in the ministry that you're doing. It's not anchored in any of those places. I think another unhealthy identity anchor is you are what you have. You are what you have. I think in my 20s, this was easier for me to combat because I didn't have anything. You know, I'm like, sure, God, take everything. Take all the stuff. I don't care. I got like a Takamine guitar and, you know, I got like nothing anyway, so just take it. My wife and I, when we were in YWAM, there was a year that we made $12,000 combined in YWAM. If you had told me, Ryan, you are not what you have, I'd go, you're darn right, because I got nothing. You know, like, no problem. And we gave away money. I remember even we made $12,000 that year, and we were like giving money to students. I don't even know how we survived. But now, as I'm getting older, I'm like, okay, I'm pushing 40. I got 3 kids, and you know, got a retirement, and we got our house, and our house is getting full of stuff, and our garage is getting packed with things that I don't even know where we got it. And these things start to build up in our lives, and then the minute you start to imagine, what if all this went away? Then it's like, that's a good heart check. Okay, what if my things went away? And there are some people that really have identity anchored in that. They got the best stuff, you know, don't mess with their stuff. You see that come out with your kids. I see this all the time. This is when I started to realize, maybe I have a little more problem with this than I thought. Your kids are messing with your stuff. They break something, and you're like, I'm super mad about that, you know. But that is an unhealthy identity anchor. The minute your house catches on fire, the minute the market crashes, your identity starts to crash down with it. It's an unhealthy identity anchor. The last one I want to talk about, and I think this one, this one I think is the most poignant one. I think we're all dealing with this right now. You are what you aren't. You are what you aren't. My book editor would have hated this point. She'd be like, that is not correct grammar. And this is what I mean. Comparison is this poison that starts to slowly infect you when you're really giving into it. And that your identity is found not in what you have or who you are or your friends or anything else like that. Your identity is found in the lack of what you aren't and what you're seeing on social media, what you're seeing on Instagram. You are what you aren't. It's this never satisfied hunger that we go through comparing ourselves. And it is not something that was invented with Instagram. I know we keep talking about it like Instagram invented it, or TikTok. I don't know. TikTok's a wild world. I'll stick with Instagram. Instagram did not invent comparison. It just amplified what was already there. And I think this is where I might step on toes. I'm really sorry in advance. A lot of us gain inspiration from people that we really love, and that's okay. The minute inspiration turns into fantasy, then we have a problem. The minute you start to look at other leaders and you go, oh, geez, I wish my leader was like that, you've shifted into fantasy. Just like in a marriage, fantasy is poisonous. And it's very clear when you're fantasizing outside of the boundaries of marriage, and it can kill your marriage. But in the same way, in a very subtle way, and actually in a way that can happen even in church communities out in the open, it's this fantasy of perfection that is poisoning us to enjoy the leadership and the church that we are a part of right now. I think you sit in a group and it's really common these days to hear like, oh man, my pastor had a pretty good message, but you know, he really should have listened to the latest message from Bill Johnson or Brian Houston or whatever. He really, there's this subtle thing that starts to sneak in and go, I like my pastor and all, but does he know about the new Stephen Furtick message? I think it would blow his mind if he really listened to that. And especially for those of us that are on staff, this could be a poison where we start going, man, I just wish my leader were more like this. I wish our church was more like this, more like this other church that I'm imagining out there, this imagery of perfection that is not real. It is not real. There are no perfect leaders. They're not out there, I promise you. When I went out on Outcry, I would interact with a bunch of different leaders, from Hillsong to Bethel to Jesus Culture, all these things are like awesome groups, love them, but I will tell you, they are imperfect. You might imagine, oh man, if only I was like in this church, then my life would be so different. And I have to tell you, any baggage you're carrying into your church right now, you'd carry right into that church too. And the minute that you're disappointed with their leadership, you'll turn around just as hard as you turn around from your current church. It's a fantasy. It is a fantasy. When we understand that we are called into community, when we're called to be a part of imperfect people, when we're called to link arms with people, we treat each other a little bit different. And honestly, what happens is this misplaced identity, this fantasy of perfection, we could project it onto ourselves and go, gosh, I wish I led worship more like so-and-so, or geez, I wish I led stronger like this person. We could put it on those around us and go, gosh, I love my worship pastor, but I wish he led a little bit more like Brian Johnson or Joel Houston. And you could wish that the people around you were different. And honestly, this sort of misplaced identity, it robs us of fruitfulness, and we don't even know it. Like we start sitting around and going, what we don't understand is that this identity anchor, when we put it into something that's not real, like this perfection, what happens in us is that we are, and we're not even aware of it, we are lowering our value. We're looking at that worship leader going, I am not as valuable as that worship leader. And that low self-value starts to get projected other places too, and go, my pastor is not as valuable as that pastor. When you start to see comparison as that sort of poison, you start to realize that it's sin just like anything else. And it could keep us down, it could keep us trapped, it could keep us unfruitful, and it could keep us from the new name that God wants to give us. It really, really can. If you've been living your life going, I wish I was a part of this church or that church, all those years that you wished you were a part of that church or this church, or you wished you were leading more like this leader or that leader, you are unfruitful because you are trying to fight with Saul's armor. You are not called to fight with Saul's armor, you're called to fight with your own. And here's the crux for me. I just wrote a new book that I'm really excited about called Head in the Clouds. And in the book, I started talking a little bit about the idea that really all of us on some level feel alone in a crowded room. Even the most extroverted out there have moments where they're like, I just don't really fit in anywhere. I used to think it was just me, and I started talking to more and more people, and I started to realize, oh no, it's not me. I think all of us, even in this room right now, might look around and go, I don't know if I totally fit in here. I don't know where I fit in. Feeling alone in a crowded room, I argue, is actually the sign of something really beautiful. It's a sign that inside your heart there is an area that's reserved only for God. There's an area of your heart that even your spouse can't know. There's that area where you're like, I'm not alone. It's just this area is reserved only for God, and I got to let God in there. And there's an area in my heart that I can't even articulate. There's something in me that I can't even explain to people with words, but God knows about it. God's there. He's the only one that has access to that. And that alone in the crowded room feeling is a sign of something so beautiful. But I just read this quote, and I think this is beautiful. Forgive me, I got to pull up my phone. Oh, a lot of text messages. Okay. So I was thinking a lot about this, thinking about identity, thinking about the new name, thinking about all these things, and I came across this quote from a guy named George MacDonald. Has anyone heard of George MacDonald? Me neither. Okay, there's the one of you, and you might be lying. I've never heard of George MacDonald in my life. George MacDonald was somebody that C.S. Lewis said, I really look up to this guy. And in the 1800s, he wrote this, and this is a little heady, but I need you to like a laser beam focus in on this because it's really important. This blew my mind when I stopped to think about this. As the fir tree lifts up itself with a far different need from the need of the palm tree, so does each man stand before God and lift up a different humanity to the common Father. And for each, God has a different response. For each, God has a different response. With every man, he has a secret, the secret of the new name. In every man there is a loneliness, an inner chamber of peculiar life, which is a very 1800s way to say that, peculiar life into which God only can enter. A chamber into which no brother, nay, no sister can come. There's an area of your heart that nobody has access to except for God, even your spouse. From this, it follows that there is a chamber also in God himself, into which none can enter but the one, the individual, out of which chamber that man has to bring revelation and strength for his brethren. This is that for which he was made, to reveal the secret things of the Father. This blew my mind. I was like, okay, there's an area of my heart reserved only for God, but what if, when Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many rooms, what if God's nature is so multifaceted that he has an area in his character that is reserved only for you? There's an area of revelation that's reserved only for you in history. There has never been anybody else that has access to that room. And our job is to go there, gain revelation, and tell everybody else. Could it be that our identity is so much more complicated than an Enneagram number? Could it be that our identity is so much deeper than our last name or our family history or your own history? Could it be that God has created you so insanely unique that there's never been and there never will be anybody else like you ever in history? And how could you look at that identity and say that's worthless? How could you look at that identity and not be blown away by yourself because you didn't create yourself, God created you, and you're blown away by the Creator to be so creative that He could make so many unique people, and you have something unique to share with the world around you. You may not believe that tonight, but the minute that God gives you that new name, and I'm really believing, I'm really praying that tonight is actually a night for a lot of you that you get a new name. This is not just principles. This is like, okay, we need to actually seek God on this, and I want to see people come to know this deep down in their guts, that they are so unique and so beautiful. And walking in, we've had this word downstairs for a while now, this promotion in the kingdom. That tonight, I really truly believe that God has promotion for you where you're at. You may not feel it. It may not make sense to you, but there is spiritual promotion, spiritual a fire that is burning in you that needs to be released out, and God is waiting to give you that new name so that you could walk into authority into the areas that He's calling you uniquely to walk in. We have the chamber of God that is only ours to gain revelation. This is why we hear preachers and we're like, where did they come up with that? That was like so mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing because you're not in their mind. And they're secure in the way that God created them, and they just spit it out in a way that makes sense to them. They go, well, this is how I'm processing it. And everybody goes, whoa. Because we're all so unique, we need to hear revelation from each other to gain more insight into the character of God. We need each other to be strong. We need each other to be secure. Let's all stand up. I want you to close your eyes. Just take a deep breath right now. I want you to ask God, what is that area of spiritual promotion that He's calling you into? Maybe you've been speaking the oracles of God timidly, and God's saying, I need you to speak them stronger. Maybe you've been leading worship and comparing yourself to someone else, and God is saying, I need your voice to come through. I have songs that I want you to write. Things that you can say, that only you can say the way that you say. Maybe God has that for you tonight.